These are never easy videos for me to record. Trigger warning, this is hard for me to talk about, and I've not ever been assaulted or anything like that, so I can't imagine how these videos affect people that may have been through that. So just proceed with caution and please take care of yourself. This is a conversation about pedophilia, rape, necrophilia, dismemberment. I'm talking about John Wayne Gacy today. John Wayne Gacy was known also as the Killer Clown. He is one of the most prolific, well-known serial killers of the modern day. He is right up there when we talk about Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and the BTK killer. He, like all of the others, did horrible things to gain the title of serial killer. He was a rapist. He was known to rape and torture his victims. On March 24th, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, John Wayne Gacy was born. He was the second of 3 children and only son of John and Marion Gacy. His father worked as an auto repair machinist and World War I veteran, and his mother was a homemaker. His family was very much Catholic. Gacy was very close to his mother and his 2 sisters, but had a rocky relationship with his father. His father was an alcoholic who verbally and physically abused his whole family, but he frequently belittled Gacy, and he called him names and compared him to his sisters. And one of Gacy's earliest childhood memories was of his father beating him at age 4 for accidentally disarranging the car engine components that his father was working on. His mother tried her best to shield her son from the abuse, which resulted in the accusations that Gacy would grow up queer and that he was a sissy. In 1949, Gacy's father whipped him after he found out his son and another boy sexually assaulted a young girl. The same year, a family friend began to occasionally molest Gacy. Gacy never told his father, and out of the fear that his father would blame him, which he probably would. Despite the challenging and incredibly frustrating relationship, Gacy loved his father. But one of the things that drove Gacy to do what he did was that he felt as if he would never be good enough in his father's eyes, and he never was. He was an overweight and incredibly unathletic child. And because of his heart conditions. He was told to avoid sports. He was, in the 4th grade, Gacy began to experience blackouts, and he was hospitalized on occasion because of these episodes. And in 1957, he had a burst appendix, and Gacy later estimated that between the ages of 14 to 18, he had spent almost a full year in the hospital, and he attributed the decline of his grades to the amount of school he was missing. His medical condition was never formally diagnosed, even to this day, and his father suspected that he was lying about his illnesses. One night in Gacy's hospital bed, his father told him that he thought he was lying about his illnesses. In 1960, at 18 years old, Gacy became involved in local politics and worked as an assistant precinct captain for a local Democratic Party candidate. This led to more criticism from his father. This job, led to a lot of criticism from his father, and that same year, he then bought his son a car. Gacy worked in the Las Vegas ambulance service before being transmitted to Palm Mortuary. He worked as an attendant for 3 months, observing morticians embalming bodies. He slept on a cot behind the embalming room, and later confessed that one evening, while alone, he opened the coffin of a teenage male. And he embraced and caressed the body before experiencing a sense of shock. This experience made Gacy want to go home, and once she did. Shortly after, Gacy had enrolled at a business college, despite failing to complete high school. He had graduated in 1963. Gacy got married in September of 1964, and Marilyn's, his wife, dad purchased 3 KFC locations in Waterloo, Iowa, and Gacy managed all of them. The couple relocated to Iowa so that they could start a life there. In February of 1966, Marilyn gave birth to a son while a daughter was born in 1967. When his father had visited during this time period, he shook his son's hand and admitted that he was wrong about him. That didn't last long. In August of 1967, Gacy committed one of his very first crimes. Donald Voorhees was the son of one of Gacy's co-workers. Gacy had lured Voorhees to his house on the promise of showing him heterosexual stag films. If you don't know what a stag film is, it is basically soft strip porn. Gacy gave Voorhees a lot of alcohol and allowed him to watch a stag film, and then he convinced Voorhees that in order to have sex with a woman, you had to have sex with a man first. He persuaded Voorhees to perform mutual oral sex on each other, and over the following months, Gacy abused several other young men, including one whom he had convinced have sex with his own wife, before blackmailing him into performing oral sex on him. Gacy also tricked several teenagers into believing he was commissioned to conduct homosexual experiments for scientific research and paid them up to $50 each. In March of 1968, Voorhees told his father that Gacy had assaulted him. This led to the father informing the police, who arrested Gacy and charged him with performing oral sodomy on Voorhees, an attempted assault of 16-year-old Edward Lynn. Gacy denied the charges and asked to take a polygraph test. Everyone rallied to his support and stood by his side throughout this time, and however, on May 10th, 1968 was the day that Gacy was indicted on the sodomy charge. On August 30th, Gacy promised one of his employees, 18-year-old Russell Schroeder, $300 if he physically assaulted Voorhees in an effort to discourage the boy from testifying in court. Schroeder lured Voorhees to an isolated park, sprayed his eyes, then beat him. Voorhees escaped and reported Schroeder's actions to the police, and he was arrested the following day. He admitted to assaulting Voorhees and told police that it was under Gacy's request. After this, Gacy was ruled mentally competent to stand trial, and on November 7th, 1968, Gacy pleaded guilty to 1 count of sodomy, but not guilty to the charges related to the other young men. Gacy was convicted of sodomy on December 3rd and sentenced to 10 years in prison. On the same day, Gacy's wife petitioned for divorce and asked the court for full custody of the children, ownership over their property, and alimony. The courts obviously granted her request, because why would you not? During his incarceration, Gacy rapidly acquired a reputation as a model prisoner. He had risen to the position of head cook very quickly. In June of 1960, Gacy was denied parole, and to prepare for a second parole hearing in May 1970, he completed 16 high school courses and obtained his diploma in November 1969. On Christmas Day, 1969, his father passed. His request for supervised compassionate leave was denied to go to his father's funeral. Gacy was granted parole with 12 months probation on June 18th, 1970. He served 18 months of his 10-year sentence, and conditions of his probation included a nightly curfew and that Gacy relocate to Chicago to live with his mother. He told a friend that he'd never go back to jail and planned to establish himself in Waterloo again. That didn't last long. However, he ended up in Chicago on June 19th by bus and shortly obtained a job as a line cook. On February 12th, 1971, Gacy was charged with sexually assaulting a teenage boy who claimed that Gacy lured him into his car and drove him back to his house, where he attempted to force the boy into sex. The court dismissed this complaint when the victim failed to appear, and on June 22nd, Gacy was arrested and charged with aggravated sexual battery and reckless conduct. Gacy's parole ended on October 18th, 1971, and a month later, the records of Gacy's criminal convictions in Iowa were sealed. With financial assistance from his mother, Gacy bought a ranch-style home at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue in unincorporated Norwalk Park Township, Illinois, part of metropolitan Chicago. He lived there until his arrest in December 1978, and according to Gacy, committed all of his murders there. How I found out about John Wayne Gacy, not how I found out about him, I knew who he was, but how I really got introduced to his case was I was online one day and I saw a interview of a man talking about John Wayne Gacy. He was a neighbor. And one of the ways that they caught Gacy was because this neighbor could smell the decomposing bodies of all of the men that Gacy murdered and dismembered in the basement. And because they lived in Chicago, it would get hot. The smell of the bodies would turn rancid. Yeah, I'm trying not to gag. I know it is such a deeply horrific act that I almost what the fuck? Oh, I almost can't even comprehend it. He was living in a home where there were 30 plus bodies underneath the floorboards that he put there. Oh god, it's insane. Gacy was active in his local community and helpful towards his neighbors, and he willingly loaned his construction tools and plowed snow from neighborhood walks free of charge. From 1974 to 1978, he hosted themed annual summer parties. These events were attended by up to 400 motherfucking people, including neighbors, politicians, and business associates. Can you imagine having a man be in your political... I'm tired. I worked late last night. Being in your political party and then finding out that this motherfucker is literally a serial killer. How embarrassing is that to your political party? Same with Ted Bundy, bro. Ted Bundy was a part of the Republican Party, and he worked with Republican Party. Obviously, the parties are not back then are very different from what they are now. So but Gacy worked with the Democrats. Bundy was working with Republicans at the same time that this was happening. Yeah, Bundy in 1974 was on college campuses, haunting college campuses in Washington. I'm reading The Stranger Beside Me right now. So Gacy and Bundy were active at the same time, which is so fucking scary. In August of 1971, shortly after Gacy and his mother moved into his house, he became engaged to Carol Hoff, whom he had briefly dated in high school. He informed her that he was quote-unquote bisexual. He began spending most evenings away from home, only to return in the early morning with the excuse that he had been working late or conducting business meetings. Carol knew that he was lying because she has seen Gacy bringing men into the house in the garage in the early mornings, and she also found gay porn and men's wallets, as well as IDs inside of the house. When she confronted Gacy about these items, he informed her, not kindly, that it was none of her business. And in October of 1975, after a very heated argument, Carol asked for a divorce. On March 2nd, 1976, the divorce was finalized, and years later, through his membership in a local moose club, Gacy became aware of a Jolly Joker clown club, whose members regularly performed at fundraising events and parades, in addition to voluntarily entertaining hospitalized children. In late 1975, Gacy joined the clown club and created his own characters titled Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, devising his own makeup and costumes. He described Pogo as a happy clown, whereas Patches was a more serious character, and he was also working construction at that same time. Can you imagine being a child and you have Pogo the fucking Clown performing for you? and then you grow up and you figure out that Pogo the fucking clown is John Wayne motherfucking Gacy. Gacy earned his money for performances and later said that acting as a clown allowed him to regress into his childhood. He performed as both Pogo and Patches at numerous local parties, political functions, charitable events, children's hospitals. Gacy's voluntary public service as a clown throughout the years of his murders led to him being known as the Killer Clown. Much of the workforce consisted of high school students and young men. Much of the PDM workforce, PDM is the construction company that Gacy was working for. Gacy would often proposition his workers for sex or insist on sexual favors in return for lending his vehicles, financial assistance, or promotions. And Gacy also claimed to own guns. Once telling an employee, quote, "Do you know how easy it would be to get one of my guns and kill you? And how easy it would be to get rid of the body," unquote. In 1973, Gacy and a teenage employee traveled to Florida. Cue the mother Florida arc, because there's always one in a true crime case, whether it's the Black Dahlia or Jeffrey Dahmer, there's always a Florida arc, to view property that Gacy had purchased. Gacy had the employee in their hotel room, and after returning to Chicago, the employee drove to Gacy's house and beat him in his front yard. In May of 1975, Gacy hired 15-year-old Anthony Antonucci. 2 months later, he went to Antonucci's home, knowing the youth had an injured foot. The two drank a bottle of wine, then watched a heterosexual stag film before Gacy wrestled Antonucci to the floor and cuffed his hands behind his back. One cuff was loose, and he managed to free his arm while Gacy was out of the room. Gacy had threatened Antonucci and then calmed down and promised to leave if he was free. He agreed, and Gacy left, but Antonucci continued working for PDM for 9 months after this incident, and Gacy made no further attempts to assault him. Luckily. On July 26, 1976, Gacy picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker David Cram and offered him a job with PDM. He began work the same evening, and on August 21st, Cram moved into Gacy's house. The next day, Gacy and Cram had several drinks to celebrate his 19th birthday, and Gacy dressed as Pogo the Clown. Right. Gacy tricked Cram into donning handcuffs, and his wrists were cuffed in front of his body rather than behind. He swung Cram around while loading the chain linking the cuffs, and then said he intended to rape him. Cram kicked Gacy in the face and freed himself. Gacy entered local Democratic Party politics and initially offering use of his employees to clean party headquarters at no charge. He was rewarded with an invitation to serve on the Norwood Park Township Street Lighting Committee. Holy, that's just a lot of words. Subsequently earning the title of precinct captain, and in 1975, Gacy was appointed director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade. Am I supposed to know what that is? Through his work with the parade, which he would supervise until 1978, Gacy met and was photographed with First Lady Rosalind Carter wearing an S pin indicating a person given special clearance. Later, after John Wayne Gacy became, John Wayne Gacy, this was in fact an embarrassment to the Secret Service, and they said this and admitted it, actually. So yeah, he murdered at least 33 young men and boys. 26 were buried in the crawl space beneath his house. His victims included people he knew, as well as random individuals lured from the local bus station or off the streets with the promise of a job, drugs, alcohol, or even money for sex. Some of his victims were grabbed by force, while others were conned into believing Gacy because of the sheriff's badge that he carried with him. Illegal, by the way. You can't pretend to be a police officer. And that was something that happened a lot with Gacy and Bundy. Bundy would do that too. Crazy. Usually he lured one of one boy or man to his house alone, but sometimes he would lure two in and kill them both. He had a name for this. He called them doubles. Inside his home, his usual routine with these men was to ply them with a drink, drugs, or generally just gain his trust and manipulate them into making them believe he was a friend. He would then produce a pair of handcuffs, which he would call a magic trick. He typically cuffed his own hands behind his back and then uncuffed himself with a hidden key. He would offer to show the victim how to do this party trick, but with the victim restrained, he would proceed to torture. This, according to Gacy, was called the handcuff trick. God, he's such a piece of fucking shit. He frequently began by sitting on or straddling his victim's chest before forcing the victim to perform oral sex on him. Gacy would inflict acts of torture, including burning them with cigars, making his captive imitate a horse, as he sat on their back and pulled on makeshift reins around their necks, as well as completely violating them with dildos and prescription bottles. He was known to taunt the victims throughout the abuse and partly drowned several in his bathtub before repeatedly reviving them. Gacy typically murdered his victims by placing a rope tourniquet around their neck and progressively tightening it with a hammer handle. He would call this the rope trick and would often tell his victim that this is the last trick. And occasionally the victim would convulse for an hour or two before eventually dying, and Gacy would usually store the victim's corpses under his bed for up to 24 hours before burying them in the crawl space, or periodically would pour lime to slow decomposition, and some of the victims were taken to his garage and embalmed prior to trial. Gacy's first known murder took place on January 3rd, 1972. He lured 16-year-old Timothy McCoy into his car. McCoy was on his way to his father's home in Omaha, Nebraska, and had informed Gacy his bus was not due until noon. Gacy took McCoy on a sightseeing tour of Chicago and then drove him back to his house on the promise that he could spend the remainder of the night there and be driven back to the station in time to catch his bus. Gacy claimed he woke early the following morning to find McCoy standing in his bedroom doorway holding a kitchen knife. He jumped from his bed and McCoy raised both arms in a gesture of surrender, accidentally cutting Gacy's forearm. Gacy disarmed McCoy, banged his head against the bedroom wall, and kicked him against his wardrobe. McCoy kicked Gacy in the stomach, doubling him over. Gacy then grabbed McCoy, wrestled him to the floor, and stabbed him repeatedly in the chest. As McCoy lay dying, Gacy claimed he washed the knife in his bathroom, then went to his kitchen and saw the makings of breakfast on the table. McCoy had set the table for two. He had walked into Gacy's room to wake him. While absent-mindedly carrying the knife, he killed an innocent boy who had just made him breakfast. Gacy said he committed murder for the second time around January of 1974. How do you live with yourself after that? He has a serial rapist, so it's like, but it's like, how do you live with yourself? This victim remains unidentified. He was strangled and placed in Gacy's closet before burial, and Gacy later stated that bodily fluids leaked from the victim's mouth and nose, staining the carpet. So, because of this, Gacy would stuff rags in the mouths of his victims to prevent leakage. On July 31st, 1975, John Butkovich disappeared. He was an 18-year-old PDM employee who had worked for Gacy for approximately 2 years prior to his disappearance. His car was later found abandoned with his jacket and wallet inside, while the keys remained in the ignition. The day prior, Butkovich and his two friends were at Gacy's house discussing unpaid pay, but they had reached a compromise and all three had left. Butkovich's father called Gacy, who claimed he was happy to help search for his son, but was sorry that he ran away. Over the following 3 years, Butkovich's parents had called the police over 100 100 times, begging the police to investigate Gacy further. Gacy later admitted to encountering Bukovich exiting his car, waving to attract his attention. According to Gacy, Bukovich approached him, stating, "I want to talk to you." Gacy invited Bukovich into his car and then invited him back to his home, ostensibly to settle the issue of his overdue wages. At his home, Gacy offered Bukovich a drink, then conned him into allowing his wrist to be cuffed behind his back. Gacy later confessed to having sat on the kid's chest for a while before he strangled him. He stowed Bukovich's body in his garage, intending to bury the body later in the crawl space. When his wife and stepdaughters returned home earlier than expected, Gacy buried Bukovich under the concrete floor of the tool room extension of his garage in an empty space, where he had intended to dig a drain tile. A month after his divorce was finalized, Gacy abducted and murdered 18-year-old Daryl Sampson. He was last seen alive in Chicago on April 16, 1976. Gacy buried him underneath the dining room with cloth lodged in his throat. On May 14th, 15-year-old Randall Reffitt disappeared shortly after returning home from a dental appointment. Hours after Reffitt was last seen by his family, 14-year-old Samuel Stapleton vanished as he walked home from his sister's apartment. He and Reffitt were close acquaintances, and they were buried together in the crawl space. On June 3rd, Gacy killed 17-year-old Michael Bonin, who disappeared while traveling from Chicago to Waukegan. Gacy strangled Bonin with a ligature and buried him under the spare bedroom. 10 days later, Gacy murdered 16-year-old William Carroll and buried him in a common grave in the crawl space. Carroll seems to have been the first of 4 murder victims known to have been murdered between June 13th and August 6th of 1976. 3 were between 16 and 17 years old, and 1 unidentified victim appears to have been an adult. On October 5th, 16-year-old James Hackinson is last known to have phoned his family, possibly from Gacy's home. He died of suffocation, and his body was buried in the crawl space beneath 17-year-old Rick Johnston, who was last seen alive on August 6th. Gacy is thought to have murdered 2 unidentified males between August and October 1976, and October 24th, Gacy abducted and killed teenage friends Kenneth Parker and Michael Marino. The 2 were last seen on Clark Street in Chicago. 2 days later, 19-year-old construction worker who worked for Gacy, William Bundy, disappeared after informing his family he was to attend a party. He died of suffocation, and Gacy buried the body beneath his master bedroom. Between November and December 1976, Gacy murdered 21-year-old Francis Alexander. His last contact with his family was a phone call to his mother sometime in November. He was not reported missing, as his family believed he had moved to California shortly thereafter. Alexander was buried beneath the room Gacy used as his office. In December of 1976, 17-year-old Grigory Godzik disappeared. His girlfriend last saw him outside of her house. Godzik had worked for PDM for less than 3 weeks when he disappeared, and he informed his family that Gacy had him dig trenches for some kind of drain tiles in his crawl space. Godzik's car was later found abandoned. His parents and older sister contacted Gacy about Godzik's disappearance. Gacy claimed that Godzik had expressed a wish to run away from home. On January 20th, 1977, Gacy lured 19-year-old John Sick to his house on the pretext of buying his Plymouth Satellite. He strangled Sick in the spare bedroom, and 2 months later, on March 15th, 20-year-old John Prestige disappeared. Prestige was last seen leaving a near North Side restaurant. Shortly before his disappearance, Prestige had mentioned he had obtained work with a local contractor. Gacy murdered 1 additional unidentified youth and buried him in the crawl space in the spring or early summer of 1977. On July 5th, Gacy killed 19-year-old Matthew Bowman. On September 12th, Gacy had flown to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to supervise a remodeling project and did not return to Chicago until September 16th. Because Gacy was in another state at the time Gilroy was last seen, this is cited to support Gacy's claim of assistance from one or more accomplices in several homicides. That is a theory, and it possibly is not just a theory, it possibly is fact that Gacy did have people working with and for him. Now, that is a video for another day. That is a big video, actually, that I'm not going to get into currently, but it will come one day, eventually. 10 days after Gilroy was last seen, 19-year-old former U.S. Marine John Mallory disappeared after leaving his mother's home. Gacy strangled Mallory and buried his body beneath the master bedroom, and on October 17th, 21-year-old Russell Nelson disappeared. He was last seen outside a Chicago bar, and Nelson was looking for, you guessed it, contracting work, and Gacy murdered and buried him beneath the guest bedroom. And less than 4 weeks later, Gacy murdered 16-year-old Robert Winch and buried him in the crawl space. 20-year-old Tommy Bowling disappeared on November 18th after leaving a Chicago bar. On December 9th, 19-year-old U.S. Marine David Talsma disappeared after telling his mother he was to attend a rock concert in Hammond, Indiana. Gacy strangled Talsma with a ligature and buried him in the crawl space close to John Mallory. On December 30th, Gacy abducted 19-year-old college student Robert Donnelly from a Chicago bus stop at gunpoint. Gacy drove him to his home where he raped, tortured, and repeatedly drowned Donnelly to unconsciousness in a bathtub as he made statements such as, "Aren't we playing fun games tonight?" Donnelly later testified at trial that he was in such pain that he asked Gacy to kill him. Gacy replied, "I'm getting around to it." After several hours, Gacy drove Donnelly to his workplace and released him, warning him that if he complained to police, they would not believe him. And Donnelly did report the assault, and police questioned Gacy on January 6, 1978. Gacy admitted to having had a slave sex relationship with Donnelly, but insisted everything was consensual, adding that he didn't pay the kid the money he had promised him, and the police believed him and filed no charges. The following month, Gacy killed 19-year-old William Kindred, who disappeared on February 16th after telling his fiancée, who knew Gacy, that he was going to a bar. Kindred was the final victim, buried in the crawl space. I'm sorry, but how do you get a young boy coming to you telling you that he was by a known assaulter, and then you don't believe him, and then you let the assaulter get off? No charge. Right. That makes sense. On March 21st, Gacy lured 26-year-old Jeffrey Rignall into his car. Gacy chloroformed him and drove him to his house, where his arms and head were restrained in a pillory device affixed to the ceiling and his feet locked into another device. He raped and tortured Rignall with instruments including lit candles and whips, and repeatedly chloroformed him into unconsciousness. Gacy then dumped Rignall in Chicago's Lincoln Park, unconscious but alive. Gacy was arrested on July 15th, but was released on bail, pending investigation and trial. He was facing trial for assault and battery against Rignall at the time of his arrest, and by mid-1978, the crawl space had no room for further bodies, and Gacy later confessed to police that he considered stowing bodies in his attic. The reason he didn't was that he was worried about leakage. Therefore, he chose to dispose of his victims off the I-55 bridge into the Des Plaines River. Gacy stated he had thrown 5 bodies into this river in 1978, one of which he believed had landed on a passing barge. Only 4 were ever found. The first known victim thrown from the bridge was 20-year-old Timothy O'Rourke. He was murdered in mid-June after leaving his apartment to purchase cigarettes, and shortly before his disappearance, O'Rourke had told his roommate a contractor on the northwest side had offered him a job, and on November 4th, Gacy killed 19-year-old Frank Landenigan. He was last seen alive by his father, walking along Foster Avenue. His naked body was found close to an inlet in the Des Plaines River by 2 duck hunters on November 12th. On November 24th, 20-year-old James Mazara disappeared after Thanksgiving dinner with his family, and Mazur had informed his sister the day before that he was working construction. He was last seen walking in the direction of Bughouse Square. On the afternoon of December 11th, 1978, Gacy visited the Nissan pharmacy in Des Plaines to discover a potential remodeling deal with the store owner Phil Torf. While he was within earshot of 15-year-old part-time employee Robert Peast, Gacy mentioned his firm often hired teenage boys at a starting wage of $5 per hour, almost double the pay Peast earned at the pharmacy. Shortly after Gacy left, Peast's mother arrived at the store to drive her son home so the family could celebrate her birthday all together. Peast had asked his mother to wait, adding that some contractor wants to talk about a job. He left the store at 9 p.m., promising to return shortly. Peast was murdered after 10 p.m. at Gacy's home. Gacy later stated that at his house, he gave Peast a soft drink before asking whether there was anything he wouldn't do for the right price, to which Peast replied that he did not mind working hard. In response, Gacy stated good money could be earned by hustling, although Peast was dismissive. Gacy then duped Peast into donning handcuffs, and Gacy's subsequent statements regarding the events varied, although in one of his initial statements, he claimed Peast failed to resist as he removed the boy's trousers. He also stated that as he placed the rope around Peast's neck, the boy was crying, scared. Gacy admitted to having received a phone call from a business acquaintance as Peast lay dying. When Peast had failed to return, his family filed a missing persons report with the Des Plaines police. Torf named Gacy as the contractor Peast had most likely left the store to talk to. Lieutenant Joseph Kazan-Kazak, whose son attended Maine West High School like Peast, chose to investigate Gacy further, which resulted in him finding out about Gacy's criminal past. There it is! Fucking stupid. Kazan-Kazak and 2 Des Plaines police officers visited Gacy at his home the following evening. At 3:20 in the morning, Gacy arrived at the police station covered in mud, claiming he had been involved in a car accident. On returning to the police station later that day, Gacy denied any involvement in Peast's disappearance and repeated that he had not offered him a job. Gacy reiterated that he had returned to the pharmacy in response to a phone call from Torf informing him that he had left his appointment book at the store. Detectives had already spoken with Torf, who denied calling Gacy, and at the request of detectives, Gacy prepared a written statement detailing his movements on December 11th. Suspecting Gacy might be holding Peast at his home, Des Plaines police obtained a search warrant on December 13th. This search revealed several suspicious items, including several police badges, a starting pistol, a syringe and hypodermic needle, handcuffs, pornographic and stag films, a dildo, bottles of Valium and atropine, several driver's licenses, and a hooded blue parka and underwear too small to fit Gacy. On the evening of December 20th, Gacy drove to his lawyer's office in Park Ridge to attend a scheduled meeting to discuss the progress of his civil suit. Gacy appeared anxious and disheveled and immediately asked for an alcoholic drink. Gacy then proceeded to give a rambling confession that he ran into the early hours of the following evening. He began by stating he had been the judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people, and that he now wanted to be the same for himself. He stated that he had murdered at least 30 victims, most of whom he had buried in his crawl space, and he had disposed of 5 other bodies in the Des Plaines River. Gacy dismissed his victims as male prostitutes, hustlers, and liars, adding he sometimes awoke to find dead, strangled kids with their hands cuffed behind their back. He had buried their bodies in his crawl space as he believed they were his property. At 4:30 on December 21st, a second search warrant was granted. After police informed Gacy of their intentions to search his crawl space for the body of Peast, Gacy denied the teenager was buried there but confessed to having killed in self-defense a young man whose body was buried beneath his garage. Armed with the signed search warrant, police and evidence technicians drove to Gacy's home. They found Gacy had unplugged his sump pump, flooding the crawl space with water. They replaced the plug and waited for the water to drain. Evidence technician Daniel Genty then entered the 28 by 38 foot crawl space, crawled to the southwest area, and began digging. Within minutes, he found putrefied flesh and a human arm bone. Genty shouted to the investigators that they could charge Gacy with murder, adding, quote, "I think this is a place full of kids," unquote. A police photographer uncovered a patella in the northeast corner. The two then began digging in the southeast corner, uncovering 2 lower leg bones. The victims were too decomposed to be pieced. As the body in the northeast corner was unearthed, a crime scene technician discovered the skull of a second victim alongside this body. Later excavations of the feet of the second victim revealed a further skull beneath the body. Because of this, technicians returned to the trench where the first body was unearthed, discovering the ribcage of a fourth victim, confirming the scale of the murders. After being informed that the police had found human remains in his crawl space and that he would now face murder charges, Gacy told officers he wanted to clear the air. In the early morning of December 22nd, and in the presence of his lawyers, Gacy provided a formal statement in which he confessed to murdering approximately 30 young males, all of whom he claimed had entered his house willingly. But you see, if I was a cop, I'd be like, under false pretenses. They thought it was a job. They thought it was you wanting to hire them. Some victims were referred to by name, but Gacy claimed not to know or remember most of the names. They never do. Claimed all were teenage male runaways or male prostitutes, the majority of whom, the majority of whom he had buried in his crawl space. He also confessed to having planned to further conceal the bodies beneath his property by covering the entire crawl space with concrete in January of 1979. When he was questioned specifically about Piest, Gacy confessed to luring him to his house and strangling him on December 11th. He also admitted to having slept alongside Piest's body that evening before disposing of the corpse in the Deep Plains River in the early hours of December 13th. Accompanied by police, his lawyers, and his older sister, Gacy was driven to the I-55 bridge on December 23rd to pinpoint the precise spot where he confessed to having thrown the body of Robert Piest and 4 other victims into the river. Gacy was then taken to his house and instructed to mark his garage floor with orange spray to show where he had buried the individual he had supposedly killed in self-defense, whom he named as John Bukovich. To assist officers in their search, Gacy drew a rough diagram of his basement to indicate where the bodies were buried. 26 bodies were unearthed from Gacy's crawl space over the next week. 3 others were also unearthed elsewhere on his property. As the flooring and walls of the property were dismantled, additional evidence, including identification cards and further deviant sex books, were discovered. Gacy was brought to trial on February 6, 1980, and charged with 33 murders. At the request of his defense counsel, Gacy spent over 300 hours with doctors in the year before his trial. He underwent a variety of psychological tests to determine whether he was mentally competent to stand trial. Gacy attempted to convince the doctors that he had multiple personality disorder. Claimed to have 4 personalities: the hardworking, civic-minded contractor, the clown, the active politician, and a policeman named Jack Hanley, whom he referred to as Bad Jack. He is fucking terrifying. What the hell are you talking about? When Gacy had confessed to police, he claimed to be relaying the crimes of Jack, who detested homosexuality and viewed male prostitutes as weak, stupid, and degraded scum. His lawyers opted to have Gacy plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and on the morning of March 12th, William Kunkel continued to argue for the prosecution. Kunkel referred to the defense's contention of insanity as a sham, which it was, arguing that the facts of the case demonstrated Gacy's ability to think logically and control his actions. The jury deliberated for 1 hour and 50 minutes. Gacy was found guilty of 33 charges of murder. He was also found guilty of sexual assault and taking indecent liberties with a child, both in reference to Robert Piest. At the time, his conviction for 33 murders was the most for which any person in U.S. history had been convicted. In the sentencing phase of the trial, the jury deliberated for more than 2 hours before sentencing Gacy to death for each murder committed after the Illinois statute on capital punishment came into effect in June 1977. His execution was set for June 2nd, 1980. However, this changes. On February 15th, 1983, Henry Brisbane, a fellow death row inmate known as the I-57 killer, stabbed Gacy in the arm with a sharpened wire. He received treatment in the prison hospital. Gacy had filed for multiple appeals, but after the U.S. Supreme Court denied Gacy's final appeal in October 1993, the Illinois Supreme Court formally set an execution date for May 10th, 1994. On the morning of May 9th, 1994, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center to be executed. That afternoon, he was allowed a private picnic on the prison grounds with his family. For his last meal, Gacy ordered a bucket of KFC, French fries, a dozen fried shrimp, fresh strawberries, and a Diet Coke. He was killed by lethal injection. You know, much easier death than what his victims were given. Much easier, quicker death than what many of his victims suffered. I hope he is rotting. I hope he's rotting in hell. That is the end of the John Wayne Gacy case. Thank you for watching. If you're still here, I will see you next Saturday. Subscribe, like, and comment. Follow me on Instagram if you haven't already. Stay safe out there, please. And I'll see you soon.